All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for November 2023. Uh, as always, this is a Kubernetes community meeting, so please be kind to each other, follow the Kubernetes code of conduct, and yeah, just have a respectful environment here. Encourage everyone to use the raise hand feature so that we can ensure that anybody who wants to gets a chance to say what's on their mind. And this agenda is entirely wide open for anybody to contribute to, add things to. I think we're going to have time to go through any additional items that people might want to cover today. So yeah, with that background, let me jump right in here. I think the first one is from Candace. I don't see her
Oh, one more thing,
on.
Rob, before we
Oh
get
yeah.
started, Rob. Please remember, everybody, it really helps us if you can pop your names in the attendees list. It really helps us to keep track of how many people are coming to which meetings, and sort of which time zones are the best and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, of course, we can't make you. You don't have to. It just does really help if you can. And also,
Yeah, exactly.
we should take a moment as well just to
The other thing I wanted to call out just as a general purpose announcement, this is the last week that you can submit anything for KubeCon EU. So that's the one in Paris coming up in March, I want to say. That is unfortunately this Sunday is the deadline for that. So again, if you want help, if you want review, I'm about to go offline, but if you happen to catch me in the next couple of hours, I can probably point you in the direction of people that can help or that might be interested in co-presenting with you or whatever else that might be.
Yeah, I'm happy to review proposals as well if anyone wants to do that. One last other thing, Rob. We should give a moment. Not 100% sure if there's any folks who are new. But yeah, I just wanted to give a few seconds for anyone who is new to say hi if you want. Please feel free to unmute and just say hi if that is something you feel like doing. Three.
Cool. No
Two.
worries.
Cool. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Always good to double check. And yeah, if we didn't get you this time, but you want to in the future, we usually try and remember. So yeah, we want to hear from everyone and what brings them here. With that, let me jump right in. I think Candace, you've got the first one, and I appreciate you going to the work of raising this. I think you are actually on the call, and I missed you the first time. Anything you want to add on this one?
Yes, sorry, I just joined. Um, yeah, I was wondering whether people are, I haven't looked at today, whether anyone else has decided to use this form to record their um, interest in the GEPs that we have open, because last time we had a meeting, we were looking at the GEPs, deciding that maybe we don't want to take any new GEPs until we move these along. But it's hard to know which ones to focus on if we don't know which things implementers are interested in working on. So, or have already worked on. As you mentioned in some of the comments on this, we can find out who's implemented certain of these GEPs by conformance reports. I haven't had a chance to do that. I thought it would be easier if everybody could take their own stab at this, but maybe that's not the way to go, to split up the work, and that just maybe one person has to drive uh, completion on it. But it would be great if all the implementers who have implemented any of these GEPs or interested in implementing any of these GEPs could mark their interest somehow. Is it too complicated?
Yeah, I think one of my comments was that there may be too many gaps in here. Like there are some this mesh conformance testing, like like I think part of our problem is as the project itself, as project maintainers, etc., is that we've put a lot of things into the gap bucket, and some of the gaps are not really implementable per se. And the mesh conformance testing, it's implementable by the project, not by any one implementation per se. Well, maybe that's a bad example. I don't know. And similar with conformance profiles is it's more I don't know. It's more something like that. I guess what we're looking for in that case is that implementations have tried it out, have tried out the new entry point. But other ones are very clear, like HP route timeouts. We have a supported feature in conformance tests, and so we can clearly just go by the conformance reports we've gotten of yes, no kind of thing. And although I would rather not have to rely on somebody to fish those out of conformance reports, I think that may be the most
We
reliable method we have today.
currently have 5 conformance reports checked in.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's not
That's
the
I
best source of information.
I I thought we had slightly more than that, but I would agree with maybe that's all we have on 1.0, or I'm not sure. Either way, I agree it's fairly low. I think that what we're seeing here is that a lot of implementations are trailing behind kind of naturally what we're releasing. And the implementations that have submitted conformance reports are also likely to the ones most likely to comment on this, I think. I think the other implementations that may not have gotten there yet are also less likely to comment here. But I could be, GK is one that hasn't submitted a conformance report yet, but I have commented on behalf of GK here. So there are exceptions to every rule. But yes, that's a very long way of saying that. Yes, I'd encourage everybody, please do comment as you're aware, and if somebody also wants to volunteer to fill information from conformance reports over, that would also be a huge win. Yeah, those I think are the best paths forward. I don't think we're ever going to get this fully filled out, but even I think our baseline for graduation is something like 3 implementations supporting a feature, so it's not that high. And I think we can get there with even a small subset reporting yes or no.
Yeah, I think the real purpose for this was to gauge interest in the gaps. And all of the gaps that are here are either there's 2 provisional ones and the rest are experimental. So I'm not exactly sure how the experimental gaps got into being statistics and conformance reports, but maybe that's just the way the conformance reports are working these days.
Wait, say that question again. Sorry.
Experimental gap features, experimental gaps features are already in conformance reports.
Oh yeah, for sure. So their conformance reports. Maybe let's take a quick detour over here. So conformance. We'll get here eventually. Reports. We'll pick on whoever. Sure, Istio. And so that's funny. In the actual definition of supported features, we differentiate between experimental and standard, but apparently we don't in the actual report output, which is maybe not the best. But yeah, they are, let's see, one that would be considered, I think this is still experimental,
Yeah, it
for
is.
example. So yeah, it's just bundled all in the same list, which is not ideal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the intent here is to make it so you don't have to submit a new conformance report when we move things around between levels.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to need to submit one anyway because of a new release, but yeah, I think it's better to, yeah. And I think the intent here is that eventually we should have there needs to be a mapping somewhere that says, I think, feature name to like with the associated gap, with the associated conformance test, with the support level,
Yeah.
with the gap status.
Yeah. That's a really good point, actually. I think the idea here is that these features are meant to be constant, and that the thing that changes is just their support level over time, right, over future releases. But the idea of what it means to support route request multiple mirrors is the same in 1.0 versus 1.1 versus, whatever. Or it may be slightly different, I guess, but the high level concept should be the same. Yeah.
So is long story short, is this not going to be useful for us to get a sense of which gaps to pursue?
No. So here's my opinion. I think anything we can do to encourage implementations to kind of do this point in time census almost seems like the right word. I don't know, but state of the world reporting of what's actually implemented and out in the world would be incredibly helpful. I think we have to limit our expectations here in the sense of realizing that not everybody is going to provide an answer, but what we get is still going to be helpful. I think it's going to help us decide what to prioritize. The implementations that are most engaged in this, and whether that's in submitting conformance reports, commenting on the PR, etc., are also going to be the ones that can help have an outsized impact on our future prioritization by showing that these are the things that are most important to the implementations that are engaged, I guess. So I personally think this is useful, but go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, Dave called out in the chats that extended isn't mentioned in the gap overview, so it's not clear if we're conflating experimental with extended. They have similar ideas, but are distinct things. So experimental is a gap state. It is all about like where the gap is at in its process of moving to standard, whereas extended is a state for a field or a feature that is all about whether or not it has to be supported by everybody, or whether or not it's optional to be supported by implementations. So I think it's a really good call out though, because they are similar words, and I don't know if we've done a good enough job of ensuring that that is a clear distinction.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you, Candace, for driving this. I know this is probably going to be something we should bring up again in the next meeting as well. But
Definitely.
The more information we can get, the more useful it could be, and certainly even just taking conformance reports and translating them over will be really helpful. Phil?
I'm certainly intending to. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you go first, Phil.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, because like the gap I'm most interested in, the egress is way back in the process. Is there something I need to be doing to say I'm interested in that, or?
So right now,
I'm not quite
good
clear
question.
what the result of this conversation.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and it wasn't very clear. This is all inspired by a conversation that kind of, I think, really kicked off around KubeCon, but the idea that before we start pushing more things into experimental, we want to push things out of experimental. And that means either from experimental to standard channel, or from experimental to gone, basically, and no longer part of the API. Ideally, experimental to standard channel. But what Candace is doing here is just trying to figure out which of the things in experimental channel are good candidates to move on, to graduate, are close to graduation criteria. And one of those things is understanding how broadly it's implemented. With that said, since yours is a bit further back, like you're saying, part of the thing we need to do is to make room for future gaps, including egress. There's a second part of what we kind of discussed at KubeCon, which is once we have some room in experimental channel, we need to do some additional prioritization of kind of the backlog of things, including egress, to understand how we prioritize those few spots that open up an experimental channel. Let's say we, in the next release, manage to graduate, say 3-4 gaps, I don't know, from experimental to standard, I don't know. Then that effectively would open up that many spots for something new. And then we need to figure out exactly how to prioritize. And some of the concepts were really tied to one, how broadly we see interest in this in terms of implementations and end users, and how many implementations are signed up to implement this day one kind of thing. Should we include it in the API? Because that really helps drive a feature forward and avoid it getting stuck in experimental for far too long. So I think that's a long way of saying one way to help right now is just to help make room, help get these ones kicked out of experimental and on to somewhere better. But then also we'll definitely be relying on you to help make a good case for egress in the not too distant future as soon as we have room. Does that make sense?
Yep. I think it does. Yep.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Well, I think that may be everything on this. Any things I may have missed? All right. We'll keep on going. So I added a few additional things to the agenda that I thought might be worth talking about before we get to triage. These are all discussions that came up in the vicinity of KubeCon. I don't know. There's been so many conversations that have been a blur for me, but I wanted to make sure we at least talked about them in a bit more detail and got people thinking about them. I will be the first to say I think all of these are going to translate into GitHub discussions. I just wanted to have some initial discussion here, or at least get some thoughts going around this. One of the things that has been increasingly uncomfortable for me is our other route types. I think HTTP route and by extension gRPC route are very clear because they include a lot of matching capabilities that are specific to their protocol, whether that's HTTP or gRPC. And there's almost no overlap with gateways. On the other hand, we have TCP route, TLS route, and UDP route, which were added to make the API more complete and show that it's, more than just L7, more than just HTTP route, more than just HTTP. But by extension, they really don't add much that isn't already in a gateway, right? So you think about TCP, UDP, UB matching on port protocol, I guess. TLS, you add S and I to that. But all of that's expressible on the gateway itself. So what you're left with in these route types is in a gateway. So what I am trying to get out of this is if we keep all these route types, to be clear, all of these are in experimental channel, but if we kept all of these as as separate routes, what could we add to justify that? Basically, is there some TCP specific matching or logic or something that could justify a route just for TCP? Same for UDP. Really just trying to understand if there are things that are coming, that we might be interested in a year from now or whatever, or less than that could really justify having these different route types, or if we should instead consider consolidating here. Micaiah? I can't hear you if you're talking, but it could just be me.
Yeah, I can't hear you. I can't hear you either.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great. I thought part of the motivation for defining distinct CRDs was you might have different controllers implementing them. You might have something doing HTTP and then another controller implementation handling TCP and UDP protocols. Is that not the case? Or is that not a good reason to have distinct CRDs?
It could be. Yeah, that's a really good point. It very well could be. But you could also say, well, you could have a generic, let's say L4 route or something, or I don't know, I don't even know what the right term is. But if for example, TCP and UDP route and almost TLS route are exactly the same and have very little possibility of changing or diverging in the future, should we maintain three separate APIs? I don't, these are questions I don't have answers. I just, for example, you could say that my controller only supports these protocols at a gateway level, and the actual routes it supports are kind of secondary or to that. Yeah. Hamza?
Yeah, I actually really agree with your sort of assessment, Rob, that I think like having too many like route type proliferations could ultimately make the adoption of the API harder because this is more things to keep in your head. And I think there is, I mean, I don't have any good solutions or like really any thoughts on it right now, but I think we should really explore whether or not a lot of these could be combined, like the TCP route, TLS route, UDP. I could kind of see where you can probably maybe mix it into like a more general L4 type route, and then even basically like I think there's like cases, like a good case for like some consolidation, even if I don't really know how that would look like, what that would look like just yet.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks. And I'm not sure what it would look like either. I agree. I think Nick, you might be up next.
Yeah, I think Michael raised this in the chat as well. I think that the TLS route is slightly different because it probably could benefit from having a hostname field like the HTTP route, so that then we have the same hostname mechanics between TLS route, so you can have a wildcard TLS route listener entry, and then multiple specific host names that attach to that that TLS listener. So I think that there's probably a little bit of a functionality there in TLS route that we could extract out, but I agree that in general they are very similar, and it's going to be very difficult to put things in there. Like essentially TCP route and UDP route are traffic splitting, but specific to a protocol at the moment. And I think most of the things that I can think about to add, you could probably almost add in the common in the common route spec, and have them apply across everything. Things like for the back end side, you got like load balancing algorithms and things like that. For the front end side, we still do have outstanding items about IP allow and deny listing, and where that belongs. And so I think there's certainly a few things in there that I think we should think about, but I think that it probably is worth thinking about if this is the right way to go. That may then have some impact on what I suspect Philip is going to talk about in a sec. But I'll hand over to Philip for that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's sort of three things that I guess are more questions rather than real statements. One is if we call it just L4, it could get tricky if we implement or if someone implements SCTP, which does have some distinct different things because of multi-homing and some other issues. So, maybe staying away from just calling it L4, would make sense even if we combine them. And then secondly, I guess the question is, I have a question about whether I think you'd want to apply different kinds of policies the two different kinds, TCP and UDP, and whether there's value in keeping them separate just because of that.
I mean,
and then,
so by policies, do you mean like policy attachment objects or a set of settings?
Well,
okay.
I guess either one, really.
Yeah. You know, I can certainly see that.
I mean,
sorry, you go.
Well, I mean, there are things like timeouts and windows. There are a bunch of things that apply to TCP that don't apply to UDP.
Yep. And things like pseudo connection tracking for UDP, like session, pseudo session management and stuff like that, as opposed to TCP, right, which actually has actual session management.
Yeah. So those are I just want to make sure that we think about those things before we just, because logically, in terms of the information you put into TCP or UDP, yeah, I mean, it's it's IPs, ports, and services, right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly what I was thinking. I completely agree that L4 route is really not something we should ever name a resource. But you 100%. Could, for example, have a base route or a common route or something that just is like there's no routing here. This is just traffic splitting. There's nothing else. It is just the common base case that if there's no protocol specific matching, we take this path. I don't know what that. I'm awful at naming, but just that kind of bucket of thing. And then let me run back up to Nick. You had a comment about, and maybe others did too, about TLS having SNI on it right now, and it kind of mirrors what we do with HTTP route, where we have a host names field, and TLS route I think it's an SNIs field, but same thing, and it's basically an intersection between what we have on a gateway listener, which we allow one value, and then what we have on a TLS route, which we allow 16 values, which gets into some fun multiplication if you're thinking about implementing this, where right now, this is even saying we have a single TLS route per listener, that's 16, and then we have 64 listeners per gateway. 16 times 64 is a lot. And then as far as I can tell, if you're implementing this with Envoy, for example, you're looking at a listener per unique combination, right? Like per unique SNI. And so the multiplication gets pretty wild. And that's even ignoring the fact that you could have multiple routes attached to the same listener. Admittedly, this is all worst case. But it makes me think like this is more complicated than HTTP because that's just host header matching, and like there are other mechanisms for this, but because this is SNI matching, it behaves differently and lives elsewhere. Anyway, just a whole lot of things to think about. I don't have any concrete solutions or anything. I just wanted to get some initial feedback, discussion. I do promise I'll turn this into a GitHub discussion so we can carry this on offline more asynchronously. I just wanted to start getting some initial feedback of what we could do with these, because I do feel very strongly that we need to make some progress and move the concept of other protocols in this API forward. But right now, I think we're in an uncomfortable state where what we have is not as good a value proposition as I would like. So just trying to think about alternatives we could do before we, I don't want to take anything from experimental to standard unless we're confident in it. And I think there are some legitimate concerns about the state of our API at this layer right now. Yeah.
And the last thing I do want to add there is we've talked in a few other contexts about if Gateway API could sort of hold something that's even lower layer than stuff that you think of as layer 4. I think as it stands today, you can't do that with the gateway object because the port number is a required field. So I just wanted to recall that out for anybody who's thinking, oh, what about an IP route or other sort of lower than layer 4? Right now, Gateway is pretty tightly bound to at least being at sort of roughly layer 4 because it has a port number, and so requires whatever protocol you're using to have some concept of a port number. But there are things that we can talk about there, but I just wanted to make sure that I called that out. Candice?
I just wanted to add gRPC route as well to one or the other of these categories.
Yeah, good call. I kind of bucketed it in my head under HTTP route because it really does include it. It's not quite a subset of HTTP, but it is very closely related. And it does include protocol-specific matching that is significantly more advanced than anything we would include in the gateway. So I think it basically belongs in this bucket here, but I should explicitly call that out. You're entirely right.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I like to think of gRPC route is it's kind of syntactic sugar for HTTP route, because anything you can do with a gRPC route, you can actually do with a HTTP route. It will just be way more complicated.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about that when we were first doing gRPC route.
Yeah, good call. Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for the very useful feedback here. I absolutely promise nothing. This is not anything that's going to change overnight. This is just questions I have. So feel free to comment online as you see it. But yeah, just wanted to get the conversation going. The other thing is, I feel like either my internet is broken or Nick's internet is broken. I can't tell. No, Nick is back. All right. My internet has been spotty here, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't talking into the void. That's good.
I can hear you.
Thanks. Cool. All right. Okay, next thing I want to cover is namespace local gateways. One of the things that came out of KubeCon and has been talked about for some time is upstreaming reference grant to SIG Auth. And I think I linked out to this in the previous one. Let me just drop it in again, just for the sake of completeness. But what this is really getting at is right now, there are a ton of, I'd say the default ingress and gateway controller request read access for all secrets in the cluster by default. That's just default deployment mechanism. And it's pretty awful. The idea that any secret you have in the cluster is going to be seen by your ingress or gateway controller is not a great experience. So I wanted to ask around a little bit to see if anyone out there is supporting variations of this that are easy to configure, such as I know Contour in the past has said, we'll read all your secrets. We'll only read secrets in namespace foo, for example. I don't know if there are others doing things like that. I don't know if that's broadly supported with Gateway API yet. Obviously, with reference granted, theoretically could be, but I just don't know if anybody's actually providing guides for how to deploy their controllers that way. So yeah, brief pause here to see if anybody has something like this either in flight, already out there, or something they've thought about.
Can you repeat that again? What your definition of namespace local gateways is?
So yeah, I guess that's a really broad thing. I mean, one definition of it is that a gateway operates within a namespace, only forwards to backends within a namespace, and only reads secrets within that namespace. Another variation of that is I only read secrets in a specific namespace, but I can still do forwarding and whatever else to other namespaces. Unclear. But really the main thing is ways that we can avoid the watch all secrets in all namespaces from ingress and gateway controller today. This reference grant thing provides long-term better solutions and safer solutions, but as a short-term mitigation, do we have anything available in any implementations?
Yeah, so I just added a note that I made a note for myself the other night when I was doing some review of some other things, that there's a larger concern about that folks have about wanting to have gateway controllers be only able to look at gateway resources in a set of namespaces, which also presumably excludes gateway class. For both of those use cases I mentioned, I think that's something we need to talk about as well. In terms of this more specific thing that's sort of slightly closer aligned to secrets, Cilium's current approach is, because we have a Cilium operator that handles the translation from a gateway API or ingress into like a representation of a Cilium of the Envoy config. Then we make it so that the operator that does that thing has read access to all secrets, but the agent, the thing that actually takes those secrets and sends them to Envoy, only has access to read secrets from a specific namespace by default. And we have another thing that finds secrets that are relevant and copies them into the namespace that the agent can see and keeps them synced, as a way to sort of reduce the blast radius of that way a data path compromise only can see the secrets that are relevant for the data path itself, rather than all secrets in the cluster. So that's the way that we've managed that. But I agree that it would be really nice to have it be easier to manage this problem of, the problem is that you want the thing to be magic. You want to be able to have people add a gateway that references a secret in essentially an arbitrary namespace, which means that necessarily the controller that implements that has to be able to read secrets in an arbitrary list of namespaces, i.e. all namespaces, which kind of sucks as pretty big permission. And so one of the things that we've been talking about with the reference grant thing is there a way to make it so that we can use something like reference grant to make that a bit more automated and only grant access to the things that you really need, on sort of a more granular way, which is a bit different to the thing that I add an OD to here. But I think both of those things are certainly worth talking about.
Do we have conformance tests on the expectations? Like, I'm assuming a gateway in a namespace can read secrets in the same namespace, right?
I think they conformance test that, but I don't think we have specific ones.
Yeah,
correct.
And we have explicit tests for using cross namespace references with the Gateway API specific reference grant, and that those, that if you try and reference a secret in another namespace that does not have a reference grant, then that will fail. A few other things like that, but we don't have can you ensure that you don't use this to read some arbitrary secret that's not actually a TLS type secret, or that's not actually relevant. Which is, again, what that is sort of about, is ensuring that the controller implementing this only has the permissions to read secrets that it actually needs to. Yeah. This is, to be clear, this is a pretty hard problem, right? Like, it's, because you want the thing to be dynamic and to be able to respond to user requests without the user needing to have the access to grant themselves access to things. It's a little harder than it might seem at first blush.
Yeah, to give you just a little peek into what could come to upstream, still early stages, but this kind of generic way of describing a reference pattern, right? Of like this, I want to accept references from this path in this resource to this other resource in my namespace. And when that happens, I want to grant these things. Like, it's actually way more complicated than it seems on the surface, because like machines can't just read and understand, well, you mean that specific reference is what you're granting. Like there's a lot that's in here still. So, but the idea that we're trying to get to is what the only thing that a controller should have access to is the things that are actually referred to by what it's implementing. That's, fundamentally what we want to get to. And there's that's that proposal. Then there's also this other, I think it feels different, but it's also closely related. This other idea that there are a non-trivial number of users that really don't like the idea of gateway class. They don't like the idea of having a cluster scoped resource that they have to install to run a gateway controller. So one of the options that we considered for that is, what if you just deploy a gateway controller that only has access to your namespace, and it has a predefined name? I don't know, but maybe that also is related to all of these shorter term mitigations. I'm not sure yet, but just another thing that I've been thinking about more as we go here.
So I guess the sort of the call out here is, when we say like, we want to make sure we're allowing space for gaps, some of this work is going to end up turning into gaps. And those are gaps that if we don't do something about them, we're going to end up with massive technical debt. And so, this, when we're talking about prioritization, this is one of the reasons why it's hard, because we've got like way more work that everyone agrees we need to do than we can do. And so, this is why we being the maintainers here, are sort of trying to take a minute to build a bit of a system here to make this more both transparent and fair. Because otherwise, we run the risk that we all get to do the pet things that we want because we have the bandwidth to make sure they happen, and then everyone else gets left out of the cold, which we don't want to happen, right? Like, we don't want to have that happen.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And we also don't want it to be, squeaky wheel gets the kick only.
Yep. Well said. Well, I know I've consumed a lot of the time here, so let me just real quickly run through my last item, and we can
Philip, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Sorry.
You did raise your hand briefly.
Yeah, I mean, the way we look at certificates is a little bit different, because often the person who is supplying the certificate is not the person who's deploying the application. Like, you have a separate team that controls it. And so I had some thoughts about, having namespaces, having stuff in the scoped only to the namespaces specific to each gateway class. So each implementation could have, access to only a subset of certificates or something. But I realized what I was thinking wouldn't apply to most people here.
No, to be clear, I think that's actually a really common case. I think it is fairly common for certs to come from another source. And that is definitely something that I want to make sure we support. All this work with reference grant is actually designed reference grant going into SIG auth. It's not just the API we have today. It's actually a fairly significant change on that API with similar goals, similar and expanded goals is what I would say. But that is very much a use case that I want to be able to support. So I wouldn't downplay it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the use case you're talking about, Philip, is definitely way more what we had in mind originally when we made reference grant, the one that's in Gateway API today. The one that we're talking about with SIG auth is way more expensive in that it's not only about granting references sort of in the more restricted subset of things that we're talking about in Gateway API. It's about sort of granting reference access to things in a way more generic way. So some of what you're talking about, I think, can be handled with the existing reference grant in Gateway API. And to be clear, we should just continue using it in those sorts of ways while we figure out what an upstream reference grant looks like, because the upstream reference grant is sort of intended to be a superset of the functionality we have available in Gateway API reference grant today. Again, naming is hard. Having the same name for two different things is going to kind of end up sucking. But I don't see yeah, I don't see that. There's much to do about that. I think the name that we've got is about as good a name as we're going to get, and we might end up just using it for more than one thing and needing to be specific about if we need Gateway API reference grant or upstream reference grant.
Yeah, and on that note, I think it's not unlikely that the thing that goes into upstream Kubernetes under SIG Auth does have a different name. We'll see. I mean, right now it's still reference grant because that's what we all know. But if anybody has any other better names, they'll be very welcome. That's what I'll say. Kwong, I hope I'm not sure if I said your name right, but
yeah, you did. Thanks, Rob.
Oh, cool.
And, I'm not volunteering to name reference grant or anything, but regarding the watch namespace or namespace awareness of the Gateway API or of the gateway, I think our our current POC implementation, our controller currently only looks for objects in its own namespace and then maybe a list of watch namespaces. But it sounds like this reference grant, maybe you need to look for all possible namespaces in the cluster. That's not something that we do. Is that something that we need to do to
No,
reference grant is an extended feature as anyway, and I'd say will always be an extended feature to some extent because of that reason, unless we have a solution to this problem.
Yeah, and this specific proposal that is going to and coming from SIG Auth is actually a more significant re-architecture that I would say just don't worry about it for the time being, but maybe a year from now it will become more relevant, because it takes a while for Kubernetes releases to roll out and become more wide stream, and for when things are alpha, they're not really accessible to most users, customers, etc. So it'll take a while. But what the direction this is going is that you're basically following a tree as an implementation. And so you say, I'm going to watch all gateways, routes, whatever. When a gateway references a secret, I'm going to look up that secret directly, and I may get access denied. And that's going to tell me, hey, I can't see this. And I don't know if that's because it doesn't exist or if I don't have access to it. And that's kind of the direction we're going with this. So it's you're only looking up secrets by following the ones that are directly referenced, and you may only have access to a subset depending on what references are actually valid and have been granted. So that's like year plus away, but it's just directionally where this could go. That's all. Yeah.
In principle today, if you support reference grant, then yes, like the way that it's expected to work is like that you kind of, your controller will have read access to secrets everywhere, and the controller sort of doesn't use that read access unless there's a reference grant that allows it, right? Like, because of the way permissions currently work, you have to you can't sort of conditionally give access based on some other objects. You have to just give access when the controller is running. What that's talking about is sort of being able to conditionally add and remove access that won't be visible to the controller until it tries to access something. And so, as today we can't do that, so we sort of rely on the controller to be honest. But it would be better not to have to do that, and that's the point of the SIG Auth bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's been a long time since I thought about like service accounts and like access to namespaces. Like, when we create the service account to run the controller, I forget, do we restrict it by namespace access as well, or is it?
I mean, it depends on the role, on if you have a role binding with a role or a cluster role, or a cluster role with a cluster role binding. It's exactly how the role bindings work is sort of up to you as the person who makes the implementation. It's sort of recommended that you have, that if you do have cluster roles, you bind them into only the local namespace with a role binding rather than a cluster role binding.
Right.
Okay. But it kind of, Gateway API makes no representations about that, right? Like, all we make representations about is the functionality works like this, and it assumes that you have read access to basically all secrets in the cluster. But but we don't sort of mandate you have a particular role structure to get that.
Yeah, and it's something like that we likely need to change or provide other recommendations so that you're to avoid, propagating the idea that every controller should have read access to every secret in a cluster. We should provide some well-known alternatives. But with that, I do want to move.
The last thing I'll say there is
quickly.
that sounds like a job for that implementer's guide. And probably that will be where we'll put that sort of recommendation. Because it doesn't live directly in any specific field documentation.
Yeah, well said. All right, Dave, I bumped you up. You had something for performance testing.
Yeah, this is a quick question. I'm curious if any implementations have started doing this with the Gateway API, meaning like one thing we've seen in Knative is as soon as you hit like 1,000 Knative services, which let's say map to like potentially 4,000 Contour HTTP proxies or 1,000 virtual services, like the route propagation from the controller to the data plane proxies is super, super slow, on the order of like 60 seconds. So I'm kind of curious if one, if people have been testing this, and two, if it makes sense to maybe make a generic test upstream so that people can run such a test and get some data back. Now that we're V1.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. I know that GK internally runs some scalability testing, but I don't know of any. I'm pretty confident there is no standard way to do scalability testing with Gateway API. One thing, it might be worth checking with SIG scalability in particular, because there is a SIG all about scalability, and this seems like it overlaps with their goals. And so just, trying to, they have a lot of experience running scale tests, setting up frameworks for exactly that purpose. Wouldn't hurt to at least get their ideas and input on what we can do. I think, even if we just take conformance tests and scale, I don't know. I don't know what we do. I am very curious. I think this is going to be, the results are going to be very implementation specific, but it certainly could help inform, if API changes are going to be very problematic, or if when we introduced X new feature, we saw that every implementation had a huge dive in performance or whatever that happened to be. Yeah.
I can comment a little bit on some experiences from Envoy Gateway, because we did like a little bit of like very like small like scale like performance testing, and last time I did it, it was like maybe like a few hundred concurrent routes, but a lot of it was implementation specific. So it's, there's been some performance improvements since then. I think a lot of it is going to be controller specific. So I don't know if it makes sense to have, for like the upstream project, to have like recommended patterns of like implementing a Gateway API controller, just given how because the Gateway API is a pretty complex API, and especially with all the references, and so that can make the implementations of the controller a little bit more complex compared to other types of controllers. So I don't know if it makes sense for the upstream project to have like a recommended set of patterns for Gateway API controllers.
And I think at the very least it would be hint. Oh, sorry, Dave.
I was gonna just say it would be good just to have what dimensions are important in terms of the SIG Gateway has a cool graphic where it's like there's like 50 million directions you can go and what to test. And I think like if we can agree on like number of routes as one important factor for performance, I guess, and not just number of routes, but maybe like time to propagate that route to the proxy could be one dimension. Another one would be like adding listeners. Essentially, there's a limit because of how row limit for etcd. So if we end up going with the get I was proposing about merging, like what's then the limit there, or speed for that, like those types of things. But I wouldn't suggest upstream make recommendations on how to implement those things. I think it was just more about these are the common patterns we see of usage of the Gateway API, and then the having some metrics for those, if that makes sense.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Well, Dave, maybe if you can follow up on here, and I guess if you do have time to check in with SIG Scalability, that's great. If not, I feel like we should have a discussion or something on GitHub just so it doesn't get missed, to kind of track progress on this. Yeah.
Also, 100 routes is very low. So I would say if you are hitting, please hit.
Yeah, well, everything is relative. But yeah. And I know we're basically at time here, so I think I'm gonna punt this last one for another time, but I'll just briefly say that there's been some discussions at KubeCon around like how we can make CRD management better and more automatic, especially now that the API is GA. There's some appetite for bundling this with cluster management. So tools like KOps, other cloud providers, etc. I'm not sure, but again, just we'll talk about it more maybe in the next meeting. But just wanted to get some initial early thoughts on that.
Yeah.
But with that,
I think the last thing I'll say is there definitely was some interest. I heard some interest from some more upstream involved folks about sort of saying like, now that your CRD API is GA, should we talk about like if we make it included automatically with Kubernetes, which I think is a very, very big can of worms that I do not want to discuss here. But like the point that I wanted to make is like people have like, now that we have a GA API, it changes the conversation about a lot of the things associated with sort of how the CRD management works. So just wanted to sort of say, hey, keep that in mind. We definitely need to talk more about this in detail, probably next week or another week when everyone's back. I think 100% agree that there are lots of sharp edges here about CRD management, and and nobody has a good solution at the moment.
Yeah, well said. Well, we've gone past time, but thank you, everyone. This has been an incredibly helpful conversation. Also, if anybody has time to asynchronously review these discussions, issues, etc., they are worth taking a look at. But with that, have a happy Thanksgiving to everyone in the US or that celebrates it all. And we'll see some of you next week. Have a great one.
You too. Bye-bye.